Do you know what time it is? It's Supernatural Storytime. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. Spoken of only in whispers. It was summer when I first encountered the fat man. If he had a name, I didn't know it. I doubt that anyone did. The letters on his mailbox had faded into the rusting metal, where only the vaguest impression that there were ever letters there remained. He never was addressed by name. When he was spoken of in half whispers in the privacy of homes and in dark alleys, it was always the same. Fat Man. Everyone in town knew who he was. He didn't need a name. The power lines hummed and crackled with electricity, and cars in the distance danced and rippled. It was hot, unusually hot. A heat wave had struck our little town. Still, every day on his porch the fat man sat. No matter how hot it was, he showed no signs of discomfort. The fat man dressed the same every day. The same pair of jeans squeezed and barely contained his pasty white blubber, which threatened to spill onto the porch. His belly button extended out and drooped down over his torso. His body was hairless. Not even eyebrows graced him. Not on the fat man. He only had rolls of pasty white skin which separated and segmented the parts of his grotesque body. The fat man showed no signs of discomfort in the heat. He didn't sweat. He didn't gasp for breath. He sat rocking back and forth on the porch swing that someone had installed ages ago, which creaked tortuously under his weight. From sunrise to sunset, he would sit and watch. He would watch as the children rode their bikes, the people passed in their cars, but the fat man never turned his head. His gray, watery eyes would roll around in his skull. No one ever saw him blink, not once. No one ever watched him walking out of his house or walking back into it when the sun went down. He would just be there one moment and gone the next. The fat man was never seen leaving his house. In this, he was no stranger than most of the innocents of our little town. As miserable as it was that summer, people wanted to stay indoors as much as they could, save for when they absolutely had to venture out. The only people that I saw visit the fat man were those unfortunate pizza delivery men who were sent to his home. They would hold out the pizza to the fat man from his seat on his porch, never wanting to venture close. The fat man would snatch his pizza with surprising swiftness, and the delivery men would quickly return to their cars. I lived up the street from the fat man, and while I didn't share the neighborhood's interest in gossip and half-truths whispered at night, I was somewhat intrigued by his presence. I could hardly remember a time that he wasn't there, and those that I questioned when the subject inevitably came up could not remember a time that he wasn't there. It was as if he had always been there, and the town just happened to spring up around him. Sitting, waiting, watching, he cast his small piggish eyes at the dramas of the lives of his neighbors unfolding around him, and never once uttered a word. I woke up one evening covered in sweat. I listened, straining my ears for anything that could have woken me. Nothing. The only noises to be heard in my room were the rattling gurgle of my dying AC unit and the springs of my mattress squealing with displeasure at my movement. Reaching over at my nightstand, I turned the screen of my cell phone on. 3:32 a.m. I groaned and tried to go back to sleep, rolling back onto my bed. I soon realized that I wasn't going back to sleep anytime soon. I groggily got dressed, and after thinking about what I could do to tire myself out, I decided to walk down to the corner store a couple of blocks down. The route would take me by Fat Man, but why not? Sure, he was weird, but he never seemed dangerous. I shut the door behind me and headed out. Even in the dead of night, the thick mugginess of the evening made it feel almost as if it was day. The street lights were few and far between. There were only patches of flickering light, barely able to strain themselves through the darkness. The street was empty and no sounds of life were to be heard. Up ahead, I could barely make out the lighted sign of the corner store through the darkness. I walked on, hoping that this would be enough activity to drive me to rest. I have to go to bed soon. I said aloud to nobody. Up ahead, I could see the shack that the fat man called home. The light was out. I thought to myself that he must have gone to sleep. He'd gone to bed for the night, if he even slept in the first place. Even so, I picked up the pace as I passed by his home. Spiders and roaches and maggots have homes too, I thought to myself, just as I moved past the swinging chair. It suddenly rocked, creaking loudly. I jumped and let out a gasp, feeling my heart pound in my chest wildly. I snapped my head around to look, my body frozen. It was like the concrete of the sidewalk was like quicksand. I couldn't move. I searched desperately, looking for what could have made that sound. I heard a hiss as something popped out at me from the darkness. Lunging, it ran on all fours. I let out a warbling cry and turned to run. Before I got far, I instinctively looked back and saw my attacker. It was a possum. I laughed nervously, watching as the ugly little creature alternated between hissing and sniffing the air. I started walking past Fat Man's home again. As it scampered up the porch, it stopped just in front of the porch swing. Then with surprising swiftness, something shot out of the darkness and caught it, gripping the possum tightly. The possum squealed, wiggling it, trying to get itself free, but whatever held it firmly. I heard the slap of its naked tail against skin as it squeaked pathetically. I stared as the fat man's outline separated from the darkness. His mouth parted, and even in the dim light I could see the rows of yellow teeth, held together by strings of saliva. His terrible eyes rolled around in his skull until they fixated on me. "Evening," I croaked. I was trying to keep my voice even and failing miserably. My heart pounded in my chest, my lizard brain screaming at me to run as my throat turned dry. Fat Man cocked his head slowly to one side, rolls and rolls of his chin dripping down over his chest. "Slug bait." His voice, a low guttural roll, enunciated the words slowly like a child speaking them for the first time. I balled my hands into fists, trying to keep myself from shaking apart. He couldn't notice that I was afraid. At least, I hope he couldn't. He slowly drew his massive, doughy hands up to his face. The possum, seizing its chance for escape, lunged out desperately. It began biting and tearing at his face. The fat man held him fast, not even wincing or showing any signs of pain as the possum ripped into his skin. I did not speak. "Slug bait," the fat man repeated, and I realized that while he talked, his mouth never moved. A thick, gunky substance began to slowly run down his cheek like syrup. Congealed blood? I thought wildly. His arm stiffened and I heard a loud cracking snap. The possum was now bent into a V. Its tail flicked wildly before slowing, huffing out the last of its desperate breaths. "Can't wait," the fat man rumbled as his moon-shaped head fixed itself into a rictus grin, the shape and angles of which were all wrong, and his dead eyes made the scene all the more terrible. He placed the dying possum's head into his maw, and he bit down. Something broke the hold that he had over me, and I fled. Running down the street, I knew how foolish it was to run. If he wanted to get me, he would. I saw how fast he was. The monsters that I had known were real, under the bed, did exist. "I do believe in spooks," I screamed, laughing hysterically. I do! That night, I went around the block to get back home. When I got back, I was too terrified to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fat man, sitting motionless on his porch swing, his mouth hanging open like a rotten jack-o'-lantern, muttering "slug bait" over and over in his bullfrog voice. When sleep finally came, there was no rest to be had. I awoke that morning to a pounding at my front door. Groggily, I rose to my feet, and after hastily throwing on some clothes, I opened it. A pimply-faced man with slick, greasy hair greeted me with a nervous smile. I frowned and thought for a moment, until I realized who my strange visitor was, the clerk at the corner store the night before. "Got a moment to talk?" he asked. Before I could answer, he stepped a leg through the front entrance. I quickly put myself between my would-be guests and the rest of my home. "Easy there," I said. This guy acted a little crazy. Still, if he got uppity, I had a .38 in the kitchen drawer. I kept for just these occasions. How about a name and a reason? Oh, yeah, sorry about that. He stuck out a sickly, stick-like hand. My name is Lawrence. He grinned awkwardly, his teeth resembling a picket fence. I just thought you'd, notice because of my name tag. Yeah, from the store. Yeah, Lawrence said, his hand still stuck out looking like a dead fish. With a moment of hesitation, I accepted it and gave it a shake, making a note to scrub my hands later. Okay, Lawrence, why are you here? I asked, still blocking the door. Lawrence bit his lower lip and shifted his hands, and I now saw that he carried a cheap, battered suitcase. Honestly, I'd rather talk inside. Every nerve in my body was screaming at me not to let this nutcase inside my house. But something in me relented. I moved back from the door and opened it. Okay, you got my attention. Lawrence's eyes darted down the street, nervously, before he shuffled inside my house. He put the suitcase down on my coffee table in the living room and settled down in one of my worn easy chairs. Licking his lips, he looked back at me as I closed and locked the door. One lunatic was enough in my house, I reasoned. Dude, you gotta see this, he said, and he flung the briefcase open before reaching in and emptying its contents carefully all over my coffee table. Newspaper clippings, maps, police reports, coroner's report, hand-scribbled notes, rolls of home movie footage filled my coffee table. Lawrence, what the hell is this stuff? I asked, starting to regret inviting him in. Evidence, he said, as he removed the last of the items from his briefcase, closing it back up and setting it on the floor next to him. I scanned the headlines. Missing victims suffer amnesias. One said, grisly mass grave discovered, said yet another. What is this stuff? Like I said, evidence. Lawrence got up and looked up at me, his eyes looking into mine as he considered me for a moment. You know about the fat man, right? Yeah. There isn't a person in town that doesn't know about him. His question cut me, made me nervous. I couldn't help but think of my encounter with Fat Man last night. With a quick nod of my head, I shook it off. Tell me, do you know when he came here? When he first arrived? I shrugged. I grew up here. Seems that as long as I was here, so was he. Even my parents, when I was a kid, told me to avoid him. Lawrence shook his head. It made a sound like a buzzer in a game show. Nope. Wrong-o, friendo. Lawrence leaned in closer and whispered, rotting breath passing under my nose. Do you remember your name? I opened my mouth and then closed it in confusion. My name? Why couldn't I think of my name? You said you had parents. What were their names? Again, I was at a loss for an answer. The name of your high school. Every red-blooded American boy knows what high school he went to. Shut up! I hissed, seething with anger. The anger was just a front. Deep down, I was terrified of this Pandora's box I opened. Why couldn't I answer his questions? You barge into my house taunting me? Who are you anyway? I'm aware, Lawrence said, running a hand over his chin. I'm keeping to what this place has turned into, my anonymous buddy. He leaned in and jerked a thumb down the street towards the house that the fat man lived in. I'm keen to what he is. I thumbed the headline about missing people. Does this have something to do with me? Lawrence smiled. You always were a sharp one. The gears started to turn in my head. Did he know me from somewhere before? You aren't crazy. You've just been, he struggled to find the right word, toyed with. By whom? For what reason? Lawrence clapped his hands together. Questions, questions. I've got answers for most of them. Should you be willing to look? I grabbed the first headline and started reading. Lawrence started to babble excitedly. You see, it all started back after World War II. We were in a race against the Soviets to recruit all the Nazi scientists we could get our hands on. Some had done relatively mundane stuff like rocketry, but others had done research in brainwashing and behavior modification. This was all done in secret because who wants people to know what you've picked up a bunch of Nazis? It was called Operation Paperclip. I read the clipping as Lawrence talked. While the paper was old and yellowed, I could make out the date of 1908 and with some work, the text. Those individuals in townships near Deaf Smith County have reported a loss of time between the time of their disappearance and when they were found. Others reported encountering a strange, heavily obese man. Still others report suffering from amnesia, while yet others remain to be found. Those recovering from their ghastly episode can find no haven in sleep. Lawrence began to pace the room. Using their research as a base and having the scientists handy, the newly formed CIA started to research brainwashing and mind control behavior. This work was carried out with maximum secrecy under various project names such as Project Artichoke, Project Bluebird, and MK Ultra. I put the yellowed newspaper clipping down and picked up the next one. Grisly mass grave discovered. This one was quite a bit newer. Lawrence stopped pacing the room long enough to look at the clipping I held in my hand and the one I had set aside. You can't even find those anymore. Not in microfilm, not on Google, not anywhere. It was as if they never existed. Lawrence coughed and continued while I scanned the story. MK Ultra was a cover operation performed on unsuspecting citizens of the U.S. starting in 1953, using front organizations like hospitals, prisons, and asylums. The CIA subjected people to high doses of hallucinogenics like LSD to see if brainwashing was really possible, and if it was, how to do it. Charles Whitworth guided search parties to a shallow, unmarked grave in the remote area of the desert, roughly 60 miles from Phoenix, Arizona. The bodies consisted of 18 citizens who had all been registered as missing persons, some only a few days, while others had gone missing for years. Whitworth, now being held under custody as a person of interest in this bizarre and gruesome case, made an unusual claim before being put into custody. He claimed that a morbidly obese, pale individual visited him in his dreams every night, demanding he show others where the bodies were. This person, which he only calls Fat Man, tortured Whitworth ceaselessly until he broke and went to the authorities. Whitworth is now undergoing psychiatric evaluation as he is being held. Lawrence went on. One mental patient in Kentucky was given daily doses of LSD for half a year. Then, of course, you have Dr. Ewan Cameron. He put people with anxiety issues and minor depression into drug-induced comas. He then tried to brainwash them using tape-recorded messages. Do you know what else Dr. Cameron did? No, Lawrence, I don't. Lawrence gave a smile that was more of a grimace. He was president of the World Psychiatric Association. I picked up the next stack of documents. There were psychiatric forms of some kind, all different, wards and asylums across a broad range of locations, dates, ages of patients, and disorders. What was the only constant? They all claimed to see the Fat Man. Whether in dreams or nightmarish hallucinations, he was always there. Every word I read, every sentence I took in, sounded totally insane. My world was fragmenting into nothing second by second. But what does this have to do with me? Lawrence ignored my question and continued. Now, even though this was blown wide open in 1977, after the panic with Watergate, only a fraction of the documents remained, and the stories keep coming out. In 2009, for instance, documents came out that stated that a mass psychotic outbreak in a sleepy French village was not caused by bread fungus, but by an MK Ultra test gone horribly, horribly wrong. Lawrence snapped his fingers and pointed at me. This is where it all gets relevant, Lawrence said, growing more excited by the moment. This town, it really isn't a town. Not in the sense that you or I would think it. Lawrence, what the hell are you talking about? I said. I had to admit it, but I was afraid. No, not afraid. Terrified would be a better word to use here. Listen, man, there's a reason why you can't remember anything. Sure, the mail gets delivered on time and people come and go and you fucking get drunk and die. But the people here aren't citizens. They're test subjects. This is all a huge-ass test. Bullshit, I said. There are roads heading out of this place to the highway. Yeah, Lawrence smiled sadly. When is the last time you've been on any of them? I realized I hadn't. Lawrence sat down next to me and cleared his throat. Listen, I've tried leaving that way. After so many miles, they just loop back around to the town in a roundabout way. We're trapped in the middle of the desert in a test town. Like something they used to use to simulate those nuclear bombs, only this is much, much worse, friendo. It makes a nuke look like a warm summer breeze. But why? My question hung in my lungs. I felt as if I was being slowly trampled overfoot by all this craziness. I never asked for anything like this to happen to me, nor did I ever in my wildest dreams imagine it happening. Why? Lawrence nodded his head towards the door. You want to know why we're a bunch of glorified lab rats? It is all because of your extra special neighbor, because of the monster that lives down your street. You ever hear of a guy called Lovecraft? No. Who was he? Some other psycho-scientist with a penchant for mind control tests? Lawrence jumped back up and began pacing again. No, he was a writer. He wasn't very popular in his day, but he's on the up and up now. He was always going on about dimensions and how these terrible abominations lived in them. He wrote about the kind of creatures that, if you looked at them, would drive you out of your gourd in a second. I didn't say anything. I just waited for Lawrence to go on. Trouble is, I think he was writing a little bit too close to home, more than he was willing to admit. Now, thankfully, there is a kind of barrier that separates our reality from theirs. Just like we can't go into the fifth dimension, but we can experience all the lower ones. Unfortunately for us, however, there are places and events that can cause that barrier to rub quite thin. I swallowed the growing lump in my throat. I didn't like where he was going with this. You see, these beings from other dimensions, they would occasionally fuck people. There are all kinds of implied events like this in all kinds of myths around the world. Zeus's numerous human conquests spring to mind, or the Nephilim for a more contemporary example. Lawrence quit pacing the room and looked at me. That thing at the end of your street, it isn't human. Not even close. It vaguely resembles one in only terms of caricature. Whatever it does, whatever effects it has on people, it is actively trying to thin the reality between our world and theirs. And do what? You don't want to see the and do what part. So what? I'm supposed to believe that the town I live in is some kind of test area set up by the CIA and Fat Man is some kind of demigod thinning the veil until it can cause the apocalypse? This is crazy. Lawrence ignored my outburst. He tapped the stack of documents on my coffee table. You've seen these, but I haven't shown you this. Lawrence pressed the felt lining of his suitcase, and I heard a soft click. He slid the bottom back to reveal a second hidden panel in his suitcase. He gingerly grasped something with both of his hands and slid it out. The room filled with the smell of musty air as a cracked and weathered piece of parchment passed from Lawrence's hand to mine. It showed some sort of ritual or rite. Men bowed before a morbidly obese figure, while it held the head of two men in each of its hands, holding its hands out at its sides. Near the bottom, I could make out a word. Biffenstren. What does that word mean? What is this exactly? That is a print from Germany, originating in the 11th century. That word means bringer of darkness. Your neighbor, or things like him, have been around longer than this neighborhood. I felt a cold, numb feeling creep up my arm. The longer I looked at the print, the more I felt like the Fat Man was there in my room, staring back at me. I passed the print back to Lawrence, who put it back in his suitcase. If what you are saying is true, then how do you remember? How do you have all these documents? Lawrence laughed. I don't know what sort of process they put people through, but I imagine it isn't too dissimilar to the same effect that the presence of the Fat Man has. Somehow, I'm the 0.0001% that they never saw coming. I'm a quirk, so to speak. Lawrence's voice dropped down. I started dreaming of this whole other life I had. Just fragments. I was a college student, and I loved reading about conspiracy theories, I stumbled across the information you have before you. I'd been collecting it for years. I even took that block print from a buddy of mine who works as an archivist. I bet he's mad that he'll never get it back now, Lawrence grinned. I had hidden the print in my suitcase along with some of the older stuff when I was taken. He said this last word with a heavy sigh. The rest I had stuffed into my computer case for safekeeping, which was brought with me. I guess they never bothered to search it. You can remember too? He jumped up, grasping my shoulders and giving me a shake. It takes some effort, but you had a whole life before this. You just need to start thinking. I saw it in your eyes. You aren't deadened like the others are. That's why I took this risk. Risk? Lawrence smiled. Look, don't you know anything? The genre-savvy guy is always the one to die first in horror movies. This is why the protagonist is put in such a bad spot. I ignored his comment and continued questioning him. How would they even have gotten the fat man to stay here? Lawrence shrugged. I don't know. Maybe they made a deal with him. Maybe they've captured him and they want to see how he'll react around people in a test environment like this one. I can't say this, however. Lawrence pulled out a ragged-looking notepad and flipped it open to a page. About midway through the notebook, he pulled out what at first looked like something resembling a tesseract, but I then realized it was a crudely drawn map of the streets and buildings in town. See this map? They've got some very strange geometric patterns going on between the buildings themselves and the directions and lengths of the streets in town, the epicenter of which is that home that fat man inhabits. Maybe that is what keeps him here. But why bring him at all? What is the point? Lawrence shrugged again. I don't know, man. Maybe they want to perfect this kind of amnesiac state that he seems to exude. Maybe they're interested in dimensional travel. Maybe they're trying to contain and localize the damage by giving him some new people to play with every couple of weeks. Or maybe... Lawrence wandered off into his own thoughts. What? Maybe they are working with him actively. Those words ran a chill down my spine that simply refused to go away. How do we get out of this place? I asked. I was unnerved by the deeply disturbing dialogue I'd had so far with Lawrence. Escape, even a failed attempt, seemed like a better fate than being trapped here until I go missing like so many others before me had. My mind flashed back to last evening. The fat man's hideous mouth rumbling out sounds that barely qualified as speech. What did he say? Can't wait? I wasn't sticking around to see what that was fucking about. Lawrence thought for a moment. The roads aren't real. We have no idea where we are. All we know is that we are out in the desert. Still, they have to get supplies to run this horror show somehow. Airplanes and helicopters make too much noise. A tram. That's it. An underground railway system. These used to be common in Nuketown test facilities. I imagine that they've repurposed one to run supplies into town to keep groceries on the shelf. But the only question is where it would be. Lawrence began pacing the room excitedly. It has to be somewhere that is remote enough that it can't be found, yet in an area that is relatively close by. I'll take a look around, see if we can't find a place with some likely candidates. I want you to keep these notes here, Lawrence said. They'll help you remember. Come and see me later tonight at the store. I'll tell you what I've found there. He walked over to the front door. I'll be in touch. See you later tonight. With that, he was gone. I immediately got up and locked the front door. I watched as Lawrence walked away, with more than a few sets of eyes of other citizens following him. I wasn't sure what to make of Lawrence's visit. Half of the stuff he spouted off sounded completely crazy. Still, there was something in the way he said and what he presented as evidence that made me seriously consider what he was saying. I crossed over to the room and looked at my phone. I realized that for as long as I'd been here, I'd seen the same old-fashioned landline phone in every person's home and every building. The same damn sleek black phone rested on everyone's receivers, but I'd never seen it in use. Why didn't that strike me as strange before? I walked over to it and stared. Did I dare try to validate Lawrence's claims? It would be so easy, just picking the phone off the hook and holding it to my ear. Did I? My hand shaking, I reached out and grasped the phone, lifted it off the hook and raised it to my ear. We're sorry, but your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please check the number and dial again. The Orwellian bullshit sputtering out of the mouth of the robotic-sounding woman over the phone was just too much for my battered brain. I grasped it firmly in my hand and slammed it down into the receiver, kicking the table aside to reveal the telephone wire. There was none. The phone was just a cheap prop. I set the stand back up as a creeping realization struck me that I made a lot of noise by kicking it. Certainly someone noticed, and there was a pounding at the door. Hello? Hello? Are you in there? Is everything all right? More pounding on the door. I crept up to the peephole and looked out with a nervous eye. An old gray-haired woman was smiling politely, pounding away at the door. I muttered underneath my breath, Please, please, go away, just go away. Finally, after moments of torment, my pleas were answered. The woman shuffled away slowly. I spent the rest of my time trying to get some sleep before I met Lawrence that evening in the corner store. I slept like shit, jumping at every sound. Murky images of Fat Man entering my dreams, rocking on his porch slowly, grinning his terrible grin because he knew that I knew, and he couldn't wait. I was plagued by strange and half-remembered dreams, brief flashing images of myself driving into a gas station, working behind a front desk at a hotel during night shift, visiting friends, going home, getting into bed with a woman in my bed that I called Marie, or was it Louise? I couldn't remember. I suppose that's funny in a way, but underneath the fragments there was something else. I was strapped in a chair in a darkened room. Thick leather straps held my arms and legs fast in place as the numbing cold of the chair cut into my body heat. I saw figures, faces that were hidden behind dark glasses and shadows, but whose voices were familiar to me when I was at work, guest of the hotel chain that I worked for at one time or another. They whispered and muttered to each other as I strained my ears to hear. Will it take? He hasn't broken yet, has he? Doesn't matter if he does or doesn't. He'll be transferred up to Arrowhead if he doesn't manage to pass criteria. Increase the dosage rate. We'll make him a good little test subject. Damn, I'd hate to go where he's going in either case. They say that thing isn't even human, so why? Do as you're told. Increase the dosage, or you might just be the next one in line. Their shadows faded back into the darkness. They said something else, but I couldn't catch it. As my ears faltered, I only caught the words, release. But even that faded as I slowly woke back up to the world around me, which was more of a perverse waking dream than any form of reality. I got up and out of bed. It was dark. Night had fallen during my absence from the hellish situation that I found myself in. Who knew where Louise, or whatever her name was? Who knew if my real parents were even alive or dead? Who knew where I was or what the people that knew me were told when I first went missing? Did they miss me? Think about me? Shrug and move on with their lives? If I couldn't even remember them, how could I expect them to remember me? I tried to focus at the task at hand, getting back to Lawrence and formulating some kind of plan with him. How long had he suffered silently, knowing but being unable to tell anyone what he knew until he saw me? It was clear to me that he was starting to crack. Whatever tinfoil hat paranoia he'd brought into while he was still a free man certainly didn't help any pre-existing condition that he had. Still, I reasoned that we had a better chance of escaping this place together rather than alone. As I got out of bed, I realized something. I had closed the bedroom door when I'd gone to bed. The door now hung completely open, looking out into the living room. It was too dark. I couldn't see past the door. A sudden panic seized me, and with a shaking hand, I turned on the lamp on my nightstand. Silently as I could, I got dressed and walked out into the doorway, where I could just make out the switch on the living room wall nearest my door. I reached out into the darkness and turned it on. Everything was gone. All of the newspaper clippings, the medical notes, the maps, and any and everything related to the fat man was just gone. Nothing else was disturbed. The front door showed no signs of being forced open. The rest of my apartment was neat, tidy even. They left the bedroom door open because they wanted me to know. I nervously strode over to the kitchen and opened the drawer that held my snub nose. I lifted it out of the drawer and, checking the cylinder, 6 brass primers gleamed in the darkness, waiting for me to speak the word. I pushed the cylinder back into place and put the revolver into my jacket pocket. As powerless as I was, the weight of the gun was reassuring, comforting even. I walked out of my home, not bothering to lock the door behind me. As I took the long way towards Lawrence's corner store, the street was devoid, completely empty of any life save for myself. A gibbous moon glowed menacingly above the town that wasn't a town. Glaring down at me, I picked up my pace. I got halfway down the street when I heard the rumbling of a car. I looked back and watched as a black SUV pulled down the street behind me. I walked faster. The low rumbling of the engine grew louder as it grew nearer. The lights of the SUV illuminated me as I burned a hole in the darkness around me. I felt like a prisoner caught in a spotlight. I kept nervously checking back as it was getting closer and closer. Suddenly it stopped. I turned to face the blinding lights, holding my forearm up to my face to shield myself from the brightness of the lights. "What do you want?" I screamed. "What do you want, you motherfucker?" I screamed again at the top of my lungs, balling my hands into tight fists. The driver of the SUV revved the engine. The machine roared a challenge before it plowed forward, heading right towards me. I turned away and ran, my panicked legs carrying me as fast as I could run. The SUV grew closer, its tires squealing as it peeled out, the smell of burning rubber filling the air. The SUV lights were reaching out like a wide-mouthed alligator, reaching out to snap at me and swallow me whole. Up ahead I saw my salvation. A narrow alley. I dove forward into the alley, my shoulders smashing into the brick of the wall of the building as I hit the ground. The SUV swerved, veering hard to the right, barely missing the facade of a crumbling barber shop that I realized I had never once seen anyone walk into, but always had an open sign on display. I was hurt, and hurt badly. My shoulders screamed with pain. I didn't have much time. I saw a rusting fire escape. It was too high to pull down, and I didn't have enough time to think of anything else. I backed up, broke into a run, jumped, and took my chance. The rusting metal of the ladder slammed into my chest, jolting my shoulders forward painfully as I scrambled to get a firm grip on the ladder. I heard the SUV's motor rumble loudly, its tires squealing in protest. I looked back to the mouth of the alley, climbing as quickly as I could, hand over hand. The SUV's lights glared into the alley, filling its light. They'd seen me. I quickly realized that the corridor was too narrow for the vehicle, but that didn't matter to the driver. The monstrous engine of the SUV roared, and it slammed against the sides of the alley. The metal body of the SUV squealed and screamed as it crushed itself against the walls. I climbed as quickly as I could, struggling through the pain in my shoulder as I went up. I could hear the mirror snap off and fly down the street as the mangled vehicle tried to crush me under its treads. I heard the engine rev again, and almost instantly I felt my heels receive a hard smack as the grill hit them. I nearly lost my grip on the ladder as I swung wildly for a moment, but my grip held fast. I reached the head of the ladder and started running up the stairs. A sharp crack rang out beneath me as a round from an automatic hissed by my face and buried itself somewhere in the side of the building. I kept running, holding my head down low to my body. If I made an obvious silhouette, I wouldn't have to worry about escaping. If I stopped even for a second, I knew I was a dead man. Another shot rang out. This one came close, with more urgency. I winced, biting down on my lip as I dropped my good shoulder and rolled it over the rooftop. I had precious seconds. My attackers had trapped themselves in the car down below. I scoured the rooftop, looking for anything that could aid me. I heard angry male voices from below, getting closer. No time. I spied the next rooftop and broke into a run, throwing myself across the gap, holding my bad arm to keep it from moving too much. I landed on my feet and rolled forward, ducking my chin down low to keep from snapping my neck on impact. I could see Lawrence's store. I was close. I thought to myself how odd it was. Not a single light in any window was to be seen. Not one curious onlooker to witness the commotion. I looked down the side of the building. No fire escape. I cursed and looked for another way down. A jump to the ground would either kill or cripple me, and I had to find a place to hide. I couldn't lead them straight to Lawrence. I glanced at a drain pipe and shrugged. I had no time to be choosy. I laid down flat, wrapping my good arm around it and tossing my leg off the opposite side around the pipe. I squeezed it tightly as I could and began to shimmy down. I might even have gotten a foot before the rusting metal of the drainage pipe began to crumble inward due to my weight. The ancient bolts which held the pipe in place protested loudly. With my every movement, it threatened to separate from the building and send me plummeting to my death. I had always hated heights. I tried not to look down. Even though it was dark and judging distance was very difficult, I could still feel waves of vertigo crashing over me as I struggled to keep calm. Snap, snap, snap. The whole drain pipe lurched forward drunkenly, bent at a crazy angle. I held on for life. Going down as quickly as I could, the pipe was ready to go. I wasn't going to make it. I tried to relax my muscles and let go from the pipe, letting my heels and then my ass hit the ground, keeping my head tucked into my chest. I scrambled back up to my feet, scared but unhurt. I looked around the alley. There was a dumpster, but that was too obvious. I briefly thought of going out on the street and decided against it. Almost as quickly I looked for anything at all that could save me. I heard the rumble of the SUV moving up the street again. This alley was wider. They wouldn't have a problem closing it off and dealing with me. I was running out of time. I looked down and saw a grate that their drain pipe emptied into. It was the largest grate I'd seen. It was easily large enough to accommodate a person. I reached down and gave it a tug with my good arm. It barely budged. I saw the lights of the SUV on the road as it searched for me hungrily. I sucked it up, wrapped my arm around the grate, and pulled. The grate budged further. It taunted me with the prospects of salvation. I kneeled down and gave a final tug, pain coursing through my body like electricity. The grate broke free with a screech. My eyes watered as I delicately put it down to one side. The rumbling of the vehicle grew nearer still. I slid down into the mouth of the grate and slowly slid it back into place. Within seconds, I heard the opening of the SUV's doors. Footfalls echoed out, growing nearer as they came towards the alley. Flashlights shot out, sweeping into every inch of the alley as I saw a footstep over the mouth of the grate. He can't be far. Spread out and search. 2-man teams. I slowly crawled backwards. I didn't have any room to turn around. The walls were slick and I could hear running water. It was dark. The further down I went, the narrower it became. The walls of the tunnel squeezed me tightly. A strange fetid odor came over the stench of raw sewage. I was trapped. The thought crossed my mind that I'd die here. I'd go insane or die of thirst without any help. There would be no one to come save me from a bizarre and grotesque death. I began to feel faint and take rough, ragged breaths. My ordeal over the last 2 days was finally getting to me here. It was like I was choking, suffocating. There wasn't any escape. I would die down here. I could feel my breath pounding in my chest so loudly that I was afraid that they would hear me. I'll never get out of here if I panic, I told myself quietly. I tried to relax, taking easy breaths in and out, letting the panic subside, not letting it take control. Yes, my situation was bad, but I could still make it. A few breaths later, I calmed down enough and I began to try. I tried to wiggle my body slowly down the pipe. I moved fractions of an inch at a time. I descended into the darkness. Time passed as an eternity as I moved at a torturous pace, pulling myself forward a little bit and pushing back towards the end of the pipe, using my momentum and the water around the grate to slide down. After what seemed like forever, my feet felt cool, dank air, and then my legs. Soon I had extracted myself from the pipe, and I landed on a rusting catwalk. I watched as the murky, stagnant water passed by at a leisurely pace, other drainage pipes running water into the dark slough that went into parts unknown. I took stock of myself. The shoulder I banged against the brick wall was in horrendous pain, probably fractured. I'd taken some cuts and bruises. There was a round hole in my jacket, entering from the front and exiting a fraction of an inch from my side. As luck had it, I still had my gun. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that there was only one exit going down further in the sewer. A faint iridescent glow shined in the direction of the flowing water, the odor growing stronger as it went down into the darkness, and I followed, having no other way out. I walked down the corridor slowly. I noticed that the tunnel descended further beneath the ground. The greenish glow, otherworldly and wholly alien, grew brighter the further I proceeded. I held my good hand up against the wall, feeling my way in the dark as I went further and further away from the surface. Up ahead, I could hear voices. They cried out, their pitch and volume rising and falling as they muttered and gibbered amongst themselves. I could barely make them out, but the closer I grew, the louder they became. I gagged on the putrid smell that emanated from ahead. It was a scent that was wholly disgusting, that I couldn't quite put my finger on it, although I was certain that I had known that wretched smell from somewhere before. Rays of luminescent light sliced through the dark, giving off an underworldly glow. I pressed on, and the tunnel opened up into a large octagonal chamber. It didn't take much effort to see. The walls of the chamber were smeared with a substance that glowed bright green, the only source of light in the darkness. There on the walls of each side of the octagonal room was what I can only describe as growths. Each was quite large, covered in a thick, vicious-looking slime. A series of bizarre symbols and glyphs covered the walls. The longer I looked at them and tried to process the shapes and symbols, the more I felt them pull me in. I tried to look past them and switch my concentration on the growths on the wall. They resembled massive raisins, covered in snot. The polyps pulsed slowly as wheezing, sickly sounds echoed from each of them in turn. I walked to the closest of them, and as I got closer I watched as the thing wiggled and struggled against the wall, moving violently. I stopped moving, unable to tear my eyes away. It stopped. I walked towards it again, and the thing started writhing violently again. I heard a muffled groan from within the cocoon. The wall stretched further this time, as the indentation of human hands could easily be seen. Without thinking, I reached out and grabbed the cocoon with both hands. The feel of the membrane's slick tissue sickened me. I suppressed my gag reflex, and with a wet, ripping sound, I pulled the cocoon apart. A skeleton thin man with a hollow face fell forward, his lower torso held in place by the remains of the cocoon. It took me a moment to recognize him. Lawrence. Years of his life had been stripped away from him. With every pulse of the cocoon, he winced in pain, but he was too weak to give but the weakest of cries. Lawrence's dead eyes bored into mine. He spoke just above a whisper. "Fat man," he said. "Using people. Thinning the veil." I started to protest, saying that I needed to get him out of here, but with a feeble motion of his hands, he silenced me. "Listen, I've seen things. Other realities. Through the cocoon. I've been to the pillared city of Irem. I've seen the plateau of Leng. I'd never heard of those places, but there was a vague and eerie familiarity about them." The briefest spark of life penetrated through Lawrence's eyes. "Stop him. You've got to." "How?" Lawrence gave out a wheezing chuckle. Tell him in the name of Hastur to stop. A chill rose in the air as Lawrence uttered that wretched name. A series of unexplainable feelings rushed through me as the utterance of that loathsome word, but chief amongst them was a mixture of sheer terror and curiosity. It is the kind of feeling that makes teenage mouth breathers open doors to maniacs with axes and horror flicks. Hastur. Lawrence laughed harder, bits of phlegm and spittle spilling from his mouth. So easy, so simple. Too late for me. Only death can remove the terrors I witnessed from my body. I don't have long. I thought about comforting him. I wanted to tell him something, tell him that we can both make it out of here, that we can go back to our lives, but we both know that would be horseshit. I ripped a long strip of cloth from my jacket and began wrapping my shoulder. I did a decent job of it, considering it was the first time. Lawrence wheezed, gasping for air as his eyes fell on the floor. I looked back to him, and I saw him staring at the gun below. Do it, he groaned. This isn't a fit way for a man to die. I hesitated. Lawrence, I'm sure that... No, he protested loud enough that the other cocoons began to wiggle, their elastic shells expanding as the people within wrestled with their fate. They begin their mewling and whispering, but I cannot make out the words. I held the gun out to Lawrence. His hands don't move, not an inch. I'm paralyzed. You'll have to do it. He rattled, wincing again as the cocoon pulsated. I held a snub nose at arm's length. The cold steel pressed against the soft eggshell of Lawrence's forehead. My hand is shaking, my throat is dry. Can I do this? Can I kill another human being? I offered a final feeble protest. Lawrence, he groaned loud, do it! I pulled the trigger, and with a brilliant flash and an ear-splitting bang, a bullet lodged itself in Lawrence's forehead, splattering the wall in little gray fragments of meat and white, with shards of bone as blood runs out of his nose like a river, pooling around the floor. Somewhere from above, I heard the fat man curse me, and I smiled. I've had 5 more rounds left. There were 7 victims. I reduced the number to 2. The last 2 must have figured out what was going on. As I turned to leave them, they were screaming and hacking and wheezing, but there was nothing I could do for them. I can still hear their rattling, pathetic cries when I shut my eyes, when I tried to dream. My revolver is now worthless. I tossed it into the sewer. I apologized to the 2 souls who have left to suffer and ascended the ladder to the surface. To the final confrontation. To the fat man. I reached the top of the ladder and pushed the manhole cover away with my good arm, sliding it on the broken chunks of asphalt on the street. There were no signs of my pursuers. The SUV and the men were gone. I bolted up to the surface and moved the manhole quickly back over its cover. As I gathered my bearings, I came to meet just where I was. I had surfaced not 2 houses down from Fat Man's crumbling home. Its door was left ajar, as if it was beckoning me, daring me to enter. The stars above shone for the first time that I could remember. They burned fiercely with a bright and malicious fervor. It was as if 1,000 spiders were watching me from dark and ancient webs strewn across the sky. I strode onto his porch. Any hesitancy in my movement, any desire to run died as surely as Lawrence and those 5 others did. Make no mistake, terror seized my heart, and the pull to flee, to run anywhere but here, was immensely strong. But I could not turn back. The only way out was through this place. I pulled the door open and walked through. The size and shape, the geometry of Fat Man's house was all wrong. I watched as the door closed behind me. A smell of sulfuric acid, burning tires, and rotting eggs emanated throughout the house. It was the same stench as the sewers, only amplified 1,000 times over. The smell overpowered my senses. I gagged and retched, my eyes turning red and watery as I held myself against the wall near the door and heaved. The wind outside picked up suddenly, shrieking and moaning like a banshee, causing Fat Man's house to rock. Slug bait. The croaking rumble of Fat Man echoed from inside the house. Startled, I shot upright, my eyes searching around the darkened room. Thunder rumbled as the storm clouds broke. I reached for a nearby light switch and with a trembling finger clicked it. Nothing. With a crack of lightning, the room was briefly illuminated, and I watched as something pass down the hallway, ahead of me, just barely out of sight. I felt my way around the dark, making my way around the black room, every movement I made threatening to give away where I was to the fat man. "Hastur," I said silently, whispering to myself. "Hastur," I repeated, reaching a hallway opening. The malevolent dark threatened to swallow me up as if I was a rowboat in a maelstrom. I made my way down the hall slowly, feeling my way through the dark. I reached out into the darkness and felt something soft and fleshy press up against my hand. Two yellow eyes gleamed with dread intent from the darkness. Even as black as it was, I could feel the hot breath of the fat man being blown in my face like a blast from a furnace. Only a furnace doesn't give a stink that chills your bones. "Fuck you for what you did to Lawrence," I hissed, my whole body shaking as I backed away from him, down the hall, holding my arms out away from him. "Your fate," fat man buzzed. I watched as he approached, his movements slow and deliberate as his elephantine thighs threatened to burst out of his jeans. Lightning bolted across the sky once more, striking so close that I thought the house was hit for a moment. I saw Fat Man's mouth open like a python, the clicking of his jaws audible above the storm as he dislocated his mandible. Coming closer, his flesh hung so loosely that it threatened to slow off his bones. My legs became entangled within one another, and I fell. Lightning struck again. His mouth swung crazily open like a Pez dispenser, opening impossibly wide. A snaking, spine-covered tongue slithered out of his mouth. "Hastur!" I screamed, scrambling away. "In the name of your dread father, be still! I choked and gagged as blood ran down my mouth in rivulets. Intense, searing pain filled my mouth. I felt something wet and slimy twist itself around my tongue, causing me to convulse in agony. Better, much better, meat sack. Very difficult to try to speak through meat, but the mind is able to convey what mere sounds cannot. This works much better, does it not? The thoughts of the fat man filled my brain. "Hastur!" "You don't even know of him," fat man replied, but I could see his body recoil in shock. He dug his tongue in deeper into my mouth, but I couldn't stop. "Hastur! No!" He was driven back again, but not as far as he was before. Speaking the name wasn't going to be enough. Pretty soon he'd shrug it off, and then I'd be at his mercy. I stretched his imagination and pierced the veil, dragging the fat man with me by force. I saw that dread being in my head in all of his forms. I asked the king in yellow tatters, the shepherd, the unspeakable one, the watcher in the water, and so many countless others. The fat man groaned in pain, screaming into my mind the most terrible and blood-curdling cries. His body tumbled backwards, and with a crash falling to the floor. "Hastur!" I roared, thinking as hard as I could, seeing down to the last detail the horrendous visages of that dreaded god. I could feel my sanity being flayed away to nothing, but I relished in the pain it caused the fat man. The windows in the house burst open violently, showering the ramshackle home with glass. I could hear the whipping and shrieking of the wind as the storm grew into a violent frenzy. Then they came. They were a screeching, leathery, winged horde of creatures. They stood on two legs like a man, but were smaller, each looking like it weighed no more than 100 pounds. An elongated neck ended in a reptilian head. With their mouths open, it exposed row after row of sharp, needle-like teeth. The swarm flocked to the fat man, surrounding him. The fat man thrust out his hands, covered in a living carpet of flying monsters. He fought for his life, grabbing two creatures at a time, crushing them and tossing them aside, but there were too many of them. One opened its jaws wide and sunk its teeth around a fat ear. The fat man cried in pain, raising a hand up to crush it. The rest of the swarm took this as a signal, and they flapped their wings and squawked as they bit and cut him, ripping layers of his flesh away as they started to consume him alive. The fat man rolled on the carpet, fighting desperately to get the swarm off of him. A living, writhing carpet of the flying lizard things consumed him whole. The hallway was awash with the blood of the fat man and the ichor of the crushed lizard creatures. Bits of flesh, sinew, organs, hair, and tendons were wrapped up and consumed by these terrible monsters. The feeding frenzy lasted only a few seconds, but it seemed like an eternity. I felt the fat man's tongue fall limp. Before I could blink, there was a creature looking directly into my eyes and with a swift movement, yanked out what was left of the barbed tongue of the fat man from my mouth, ripping my tongue. I gave a sharp scream of pain and began clutching my mouth, rocking back and forth on the floor. It took no more interest in me and then joined the others. Finally, the scream stopped. The fluttering and squawking of the flying creature stopped. The storm stopped. All has become still. Then with a concentrated, singular effort, the creatures spread their wings and took flight. They were carrying the remains of the fat man with them. I scrambled to a nearby window and watched as they flew off, not into the horizon, but straight up into space, disappearing into the night. I got up and stumbled back to the living room. I see headlights now, through the busted-out windows. I don't care anymore. If I get killed, so be it. I just want it to end. My mind teeters on the brink of total exhaustion. I see them, the men from earlier. They have their guns drawn. I don't care. One in charge tells them to stand down. He tells me, well done, that he hadn't seen anything like that before. He asks what I want, and I say that I just want to go home. He laughed, but then he said, he'll make it happen. I tried to walk, but I've had too much. I collapsed there on the fat man's porch. I woke up in a hotel room. There's a new wardrobe, a wallet, and an envelope on a nearby nightstand. Light, real light, streamed in from the window. I got up and I looked over an open bay. Boats in the marina, cars in the streets, people on the sidewalks, civilization. A real city. I reached up and tore open the envelope. It was empty save for an address and a series of numbers. The phone rang and I picked it up. Hello? My voice didn't sound like my own, not even close. Greetings. First, let me offer you my most sincere congratulations on passing all the evaluations. Who is this? My throat rattled. The voice on the other end continued as if I never spoke. A new wardrobe has been provided for you, along with an all-expense-paid hotel in beautiful downtown Corpus Christi, Texas. Consider it a vacation. Thanks. It was supposed to sound sarcastic, but I didn't even manage that. Our sources indicate that you found the envelope. That is the address of a bank downtown. The contents of the safe deposit box are yours. That is compensation for your successful completion of the test. Let me guess. I can't tell anyone, otherwise I'll end up dead, right? The voice on the other end chuckled. Of course not. Only a madman would believe something like that. Not that I was there, but I've read the reports. A testing facility where they brainwash people in the desert is the most believable part of your ordeal. Feel free to tell anyone. Or no one. We don't really care as long as they think it's fake. And if they don't, the voice on the line grew razor sharp, then we will carry out orders as protocol requires and reappropriate you for disposal. I see. Enjoy your new life. You've earned it. I could practically hear him smiling on the other end, gushing as if I'd just graduated college rather than survived a horrific ordeal. Be sure to mind your P's and Q's, though, the voice went on, cautioning me. We'll be watching you. With that, the line went dead. I checked out of the hotel a few days later and drove to the bank. The contents of the security box helped me make a new life, far, far away from the desert. I haven't tried to reach anyone from my past life, and I doubt I ever will. The weathered, beaten-down face with the shocks of white hair only vaguely resemble the person that I was before. There are times, though, when the summers grow hot and the stars shine bright, that I hurry home. I think about Lawrence and all the others I left behind. There in a notebook underneath my bed, I write over and over the name of the dread unspeakable one, until I set myself into feverish sleep. It makes me feel better. You could say that it is my anti-madness mantra. I, and by extension, everything on planet Earth, live on borrowed time. There are things waiting beyond the veil, biding their time for their hateful children or worshippers to usher them forth. For when that day comes, not a bird or beast upon the earth will be safe. Not a thing will escape them. Nothing lasts forever. Only the stars are close to being eternal, and even their death is eventual, as is ours.